Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. I'm Chucky2009, and you're watching my second ever Teach Yourself to Weld series on MIG welding. But you probably already know that because if you're watching this, you clicked on a video called. Alright, but enough about that. Basically, what we're going to do is go for part one of this series, which is this one, intended for someone who has little to no MIG welding experience, all the way up through welding some, just running some beads at first. We'll be doing some basic fillet, lap, and other types of joints. We'll be welding vertically, we'll be welding overhead, and I'm going to teach you guys a little bit about the theory behind MIG welding. So, alright, this is obviously part one of the series, and in part one we're going to talk about the equipment we're going to be using, and we're going to be setting up the machine. Now, when I say setting up the machine, I mean we're going to set up the machine. This isn't one of those stage technical videos where someone's like, turn the dial to the desired wire feed speed. No, I mean literally, I haven't used this thing in months and we're going to get it set up. So this episode here is designed for someone who really is new to MIG welding. If you've been welding for a while, you already know how to set up the machine, and you can establish an arc and keep it from going out, put down something that looks like a little weld puddle. You can probably skip ahead to part two if you choose. Alternatively, you can hang out and watch part one. So, let's have a look at some welding gear. As mentioned, this is the welder that we're going to be using, but before we get to that, let's talk about some safety gear. I know everyone thinks it's mind-numbingly boring, but I mean, you know, we're going to be using enough electricity to kill someone dozens of times over, so it is mildly important. Alright, you're obviously going to need a welding helmet. You know, this is the helmet I've been using out here. It served me pretty well. We got some glasses. Safety glasses are important while welding because there's always little bits of crap silicone residue from MIG welding. It's going to be going places, and well, you never know what's going to happen. They're cheap insurance. We have gloves, self-explanatory. Wire brush, we'll need that for cleaning our welds. And we've got this set of welding leathers. Now, do you really need full leathers for MIG welding? Short circuit, of course. No, you really don't, in my opinion. But you're going to need something. We've all seen on TV where people MIG weld. Usually it's MIG welding. There's a lot of MIG welding footage out there, people doing like a t-shirt or no shirt. You'll see a lot of people MIG weld without any sort of skin protection, and that's really bad because there's molten spatter flying everywhere, there's a bright arc, and if you don't, you're going to burn yourself really badly because I've been there and done that. I used to think, oh, it's just MIG, it's not that bad, and on the next day I looked like a lobster. So definitely you're going to want to cover yourself up. Now for the welder. This is a Hobart Handler 187. It's been an excellent machine for me. This was the first welder that I ever bought new. Now the main reason I'm including the setup of this machine in this video is because, like I said, I haven't touched this thing in months. So if you buy a welder off of Craigslist, it's probably, you know, going to look something like this. Everything's all tangled up. Nobody's used it in a while. And so I thought it'd be good to include it in this series. So the first thing you're going to want to do is separate all these cord-like things that we have on top of the welder. And once you've got all the cords unpiled up and you got them all stretched out and ready to go, the next thing you're going to want to do is inspect the gear that you have to work with. Now, if you just bought your welder brand new, you really don't have a whole lot to worry about, but personally, my first welder was a Craigslist special, and maybe yours was too. So, either way, let's have a look. Some things you're going to want to, well, look for. Now, this MIG gun happens to be a flex head MIG gun, but for this purpose, it'll be about like any other MIG gun. Basically, you're going to want to look at the handle and make sure it's not just totally destroyed. I've seen these things get run over and horrendously cracked and whatnot. Once you plug the welder in and you fire it up, you want to pull the trigger a few times to make sure you hear a clicking sound coming from your welder, which will be the drive rolls and the gas solenoid turning on and off, or, you know, some wire sticking out the front if it has wire in it, like this one currently doesn't. Why, you ask? Because I took the spool out so I could show you guys how to put a spool in. But yeah, just make sure the trigger works, make sure the handle's not destroyed. And up in the very front of the gun, we'll have a look at a few things. This big silver thing is called a cone, or nozzle as some people refer to it. And again, you'll just want to make sure this isn't totally destroyed. You'll want to look around the inside of the cone and make sure that it's not totally full of spatter. and you'll want to remove it. Now this one just pulls straight off, some of them screw off. You know, it varies just depending on the style of MIG gun that you have. And this copper colored piece here is referred to as the tip, or the contact tip, or the contact tube as some people call it. But basically you're going to want to have a look at the hole in the center of it and make sure it's round. The ground clamp is pretty much self-explanatory. Just make sure it is actually a ground clamp and that the lead running to it isn't totally destroyed. And when you press it open, you want to make sure that the contact surfaces are relatively clean. They don't have to be spotless or anything, but if they're rusty and covered in crap, you know, you might have grounding issues. There are plenty of machines out there on the market that only do what's referred to on the boxes of these machines as gasless flux core, or gasless MIG, or flux core MIG, and that doesn't actually have anything to do with MIG welding. That's self-shielded flux core, which is an entirely different animal. Some of what we're talking about in this video will carry over to that process, but most things will not. And the way you tell that is, you know, if it's a larger machine with a higher price tag, it's probably fine. A lot of those are, you know, price-wise very economical machines. But what you're going to want to look for is this gas fitting on the back. Self-shielded flux core doesn't actually require shielding gas, you know, obviously, hence the name. So if you have this, you're probably set. If it came with a gas hose and a regulator, you're probably set. And there's another gas hose that runs from the welder to this connection for the MIG gun, and that's obviously another surefire sign. Now we're just going to inspect this real quick. As you can see, it actually looks like copper wire. When I first saw MIG wire, I thought it was copper wire actually. But it's solid steel wire that has a copper colored coating on it to protect it from rust and corrosion and things along those lines. Now this coating won't make it impervious to rust, but it will slow down the oxidation process. So if your MIG welder is used and it came with some wire, you're going to want to have a look at it, make sure it's still bright and shiny like this is, and make sure it's not totally covered in rust. Now what's wrong with a little rust, you ask? Well, it's probably not going to feed right, it's probably going to crap up your liner, and it's probably not going to weld worth anything. However, that being said, sometimes with a spool of MIG wire, just the outer couple strands are what's rusted and everything underneath it is fine. So if your welder came with a spool and it's all rusty and nasty from what you see, you know, maybe you'll want to start pulling off some wire until you get down to the clean wire, unless there's no clean wire, in which case, you know, you have a few pounds of scrap metal. But yeah, just pretty much just make sure it's not all nasty and you're good. Alright, now I've got the welder ready to turn on, and we're going to be putting some MIG wire in our MIG welder. So what you're going to need for this is obviously your spool of wire, and you're going to need some wire cutters. Side cutters are ideal, regular pliers with a wire cutting function, or just, they work too. And basically what you're going to want to do is to install this spool. You want to make sure there's obviously a little bit of wire hanging out. You're going to want to make sure that is, in most cases, on the bottom of the spool, assuming your wire feed assembly is on the bottom of the welder. There's probably some that are kind of backwards where this wire feed assembly is up here, and in which case you'd want the wire to be coming off the top of the spool. What you don't want is the wire to come off the top of the spool and go down like such, because that's going to affect how well it feeds. So you're going to want to line up these holes in your spool with the, I'll just call it the stud on this assembly here. And then you're going to want to put this big goofy plastic nut back on. Now on this particular Hobart machine, it's this thing, which is left-hand threaded so the spool doesn't flop off. But on different machines, you're going to have a different way of affixing the spool onto this stud, you know, attachment point thing. But like I said, on my machine it just goes on like that. So as you can see, mine's already loose because, well, like I told you guys, I took the spool out, and basically you're going to want to have the tension off. However that's set up on your machine, they're all pretty much the same, but they're all still a little bit different. Alright, so now I'm going to take the end of the wire off our spool, and I'm going to cut off the part that's screwed up from being bent. Now I'm going to feed this, I'm going to feed my MIG wire here between the drive rolls, or between where the drive rollers would be if there was tension on them, and the end of the wire is going to go in that little silver thing called the liner. Now, on another note, liners do wear out over time, If you bought your machine new, again, you shouldn't have anything to worry about. But if you bought it used and you can afford the few bucks for a new liner, it's really cheap insurance. However, when I bought my first MIG welder, that probably would have broke my bank, so I did it and I was just fine. But anyway, once you've got the start of the wire into the liner, you're going to want to put this thing back down and put tension back on your feed assembly. And you should be able to take your hand away without wire just going everywhere. Alright, now before we start feeding the wire through here and down the gun, what I'm going to do is remove this nozzle, and I'm going to remove the contact tip. Now as a side note, you're going to want to make sure your contact tip is the same, well, it's for the size wire that we're feeding. It'll say on the tip in little letters, I don't know if the camera can pick that up, and you'll want to match that to whatever your spool says. The reason why we're removing this is because if we don't, then the wire's going to come out the tip of the liner, and you know, it's probably not going to go in that tiny hole. It'll probably hit the side. Sometimes it goes through the hole, but I'm pretty unlucky and it usually doesn't for me. So with that being said, it's now time to fire up the welder. Now what I'm going to do is make sure my wire feed speed is set all the way up or close to it. Just don't have it set all the way down, or else it's going to take you all friggin' day to feed wire through your MIG gun. Next, I'm going to hold this I don't know, what are we going to call this? Lead, even though that's not the right term. I can't think of the right term right now. I'm going to hold this thing as straight as I can get it, and pull the trigger and hold it down until I see wire shoot out the end of my MIG gun. It's speeding, ladies and gentlemen. How long this takes is going to depend on how high your wire feed speed is and how long your MIG gun is. And just like that, we've got wire sticking out the end of the MIG gun. And now, I'm just going to take the tip and slide it down this wire and screw it in. Now I'll take the nozzle, put it back on, flip off the end of the wire, and we're ready to go. And now it's time to set up our regulator. I'm just going to turn this off so y'all can hear me. Basically, we're going to be using this HTP flow meter, which is a little bit different than a regulator, although it serves the same exact purpose for MIG welding. And basically, you're going to want to get yourself a big old shielding gas cylinder full of either 75% argon, 25% carbon dioxide like this one. That's personally what I recommend. That's what I use. Or you can get 80-20 or all carbon dioxide. I'm not going to go into the differences too much in this video to keep it short. That information's out there on the internet, and I actually put together another video on, you know, acquiring a shielding gas cylinder. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to take the end of this and just thread it in here as such. This part's pretty self-explanatory, but what you need to keep in mind is that this flow meter is made out of brass, and the neck of the cylinder is made out of, it's obviously some kind of yellowish non-ferrous soft metal. I don't know offhand, but it's not steel, and as I said, this is brass, so you really don't want to crank down on it too much, but you definitely want to snug it up a little bit. I just go about like such, but do it at your own risk. Alright, now what I'm going to do is walk around to the wire spool side of the welder, and I'm going to take the tension off of our feed assembly so that way we don't actually waste any wire. This is optional, but I like to do it because, well, I don't like wasting things. So now we're not going to be feeding any wire, and I'm going to turn this back on and grab my MIG gun. Alright, now it's time to set the flow rate. Now for a flow meter, this is going to be a little bit different, but on an actual regulator, it's pretty similar. The first thing we're going to do once we make sure this is good and tight is we're going to slowly open the cylinder here. I turn it just a little bit until this needle starts to rise, and then I let this thing come up to pressure, and once that's done, I open this all the way. Now the reason for this is because these cylinders seal so they're leak tight when they're all the way closed and when they're all the way open. If you leave them in between like a lot of people do, you'll end up costing yourself some shielding gas. Probably not a lot, but you know, it's with these cylinders you really want to open them all the way. Now, a lot of the time when people tell you not to, they're referring to fuel gas cylinders like on a cutting torch. And those, if you only open them a little bit, then if there's an accident or you need to put out the torch real quick, you can close it with like one turn. It's really fast. But, alright, now what we're going to do is set the flow rate. With the tension taken off our drive rollers, I'm going to pull this trigger, and this ball is going to go to whatever cubic feet an hour we're currently dispensing gas at. Looks to be between 30 and 35, and this is way too high for what we're going to be doing. I generally MIG weld at about 15 to 20 CFH, so I'm just going to turn this down. That's up, this way is down. I'm just going to set it to about there. Take my finger off the trigger, and it'll stop. Now, if you have an actual regulator, setup's not all that different, but instead of reading from this, you'll have a secondary gauge with a T-handle on it with a T-screw, and you're just going to want to adjust the screw like I adjusted this until it's reading the desired, gas flow. Now this thing has a really long post flow because I think the gas solenoid sticks open sometimes, but either way, we now have gas, and as soon as I put the tension back on our feed assembly, we're ready to weld. Good. Now the next thing you're going to want to do is acquire a piece of scrap metal to lay some beads on. This is a 1/4 inch thick and it's approximately 4x4, and that's about what I'd recommend. Now you're going to want to make sure it's not too nasty and disgusting. And the reason for this is because MIG welding is not a process that's very tolerant of crap. Mill scale is normally okay. You shouldn't have to grind down to bare metal, but any sort of rust, paint, powder coat, oil, that type of thing will have a very negative impact upon your welds. The reason for this is that flux shielded welding processes such as stick welding or, flux core welding, the slag kind of has sort of a cleaning action. It absorbs this crap as you weld, so to speak. I mean, you still want it clean, but you can get away with a lot more on a, non-gas shielded process. MIG, however, is a gas shielded process, so you're going to want to have it relatively clean. And the next thing you're going to want to do is to set your welder. Now, what we're going to be doing today is a very basic drill, which is going to help you get used to pulling the trigger, starting a puddle, moving the puddle a little bit, and then once you feel confident with that, we're going to run a pad of beads. So basically, with this machine, we're lucky in the sense that we have this awesome door chart, and for most fabrication work, I remember that this chart is a little bit on the cold side, but it sure does give you an awesome starting reference on where to set things and adjust from there. So with this chart, we're going to come down here to the parameters we're using. We're obviously welding steel, so that's going to narrow it down to the top 3 rows. We got flux core wire, we're not using that. Solid wire ER70S6, which is what we're using, with a C25 gas mixture. There's all sorts of dust and crap on here. 75% argon, 25% CO2. Produces less spatter and has a better appearance relative to 100% CO2. And we're using 23 thousandths. 23 thousandths or 24 thousandths, really, it's not going to have that big of a impact. And for our 1/4 inch material, we're going to, oh crap, it doesn't go up that high. Yeah, this is something else I'm going to talk about. For this exercise, if we're just running beads on something, you don't actually have to set it to the thickness of the material. Like if you have a 1-inch piece of steel, just set it for 3/16 or 1/4 inch. Assuming you're using a 1/4 inch piece of metal, I'd set it for 3/16 or 1/4 inch, or 3/8 maybe. If your machine goes that high, it'll just get hot kind of fast. But this one only goes up to 3/16 with this size wire. As you can see, if you want to weld 1/4 inch or 5/16, you have to come down here to the next size up of wire. But for 23 thousandths, it recommends a voltage setting of 6 and a wire feed speed of 90. And this is pretty self-explanatory. In fact, it's already set to this. Man, I need to start sabotaging things before my videos. Yeah, now let's talk about wire sizes for a minute. We're using 23 thousandths inch because, well, this flex head MIG gun has a 30 thousandths inch liner, so it can't take any wire larger than 30 thousandths of an inch. And the only wire I have in smaller spools is 23 thousandths for really thin metal, and 35 thousandths, which is obviously too big to squish through a 30 thousandths inch liner. What do I recommend? I recommend for auto body work and anything up to 1/8 of an inch or so, sticking with this really skinny 23 or 24 thousandths wire. And for anything else on a machine like this, generally 30 thousandths or 35 thousandths. Honestly, I've used them both. I don't really notice that big of a difference. It's just a minor settings tweak. But there's a lot of overlap. I mean, you can weld really thin material with 35 thousandths wire, just not quite as ideal. Or you can weld, you know, thicker material with thinner wire, just not quite as ideal. But for running some beads, it's not going to hurt anything. Alright, let's turn the welder back on and get ready to weld. Now, if you don't have a handy dandy door chart on your machine, or worse, you have one but it sucks, there's various iPhone apps. I know Miller has a really good one that gives you recommended weld specs. You know, you just plug in, I'm welding this thickness of this type of material with this wire and this process, and it spits out however many inches a minute and volts it wants you to run. And that's a lot better than nothing, let's say. So that's just another thing for you to keep in mind. Alright, now this exercise, as mentioned, is just to get you to become a little bit familiar with MIG welding. Basically, what you're going to want to do is use your offhand as your support hand like such, and use that to support the hand that you're holding the MIG gun with for optimum stability. And you're going to want to get yourself set up so that this ways you're about 90 degrees, you know, perpendicular from the joint. And this brings up the question of, do you want to pull your puddle or do you want to push your puddle? But people have been arguing about that as long as people have been arguing about stuff on the internet. So I'm not really going to go into it, and I'll probably do a little bit of both in this Teach Yourself MIG Welding series. But anyway, basically, all we're going to do is hold our cone maybe a 1/4 inch or so up off the plate. I mean, you know, a lot of people, myself included, when I first started welding, I was kind of quote-unquote afraid of the arc, and I'd hold the thing like back here. And if you do this, MIG welding is just going to pop and crackle, and you're going to have horrendous porosity. And that's if you have anything at all. It'll probably just be random globs of metal. So you're going to want to hold this in pretty close. And how close? Well, you obviously don't want to stick your cone in the weld puddle, but I would recommend holding it as close to the weld puddle as you can without sticking it in the weld puddle. Then we're just going to pull the trigger with the machine on, of course, and this is going to spit some wire out. It's going to initiate the shielding gas flow as well as the electrical current, and that's going to cause a little molten blob to form. And then I'm going to move that little molten blob about, I don't know, a half inch or a full inch, let's say. And then I'm going to release the trigger, break the arc, and, well, come down a little bit and do it again. Again, I'll support the MIG gun for optimum stability. I'll make sure I'm 90 degrees this way, and I'll give it a slight pull angle. Alright, that's a little bit longer an inch. But I had an ingenious thought, YouTube. Maybe, if you're doing this, you should practice both pushing and pulling, because I've been thinking about it a little bit, and I've been in plenty of situations where because of the way the joint's set up, or if there's something in the way, you can't push, or you can't pull, you have to do the other one. And so, now would be the chance to become a little bit familiar with both, and maybe see what you like best. Now let's talk about how not to do this. If you hold your gun in too close, you're obviously going to stick the cone in the puddle, but if you hold it too far back, this happens. You kind of want to listen for a certain sound. That's obviously a mess, but if you hold it in close enough, it should sound like, well, what you've been listening to, aka this. Sounds kind of remotely like bacon frying, as everyone's going to tell you. Alright, and here is our finished product. As you can see, we've got a number of short welds, some wider than others. Now the main thing you're going to want to do to control width, besides, you know, adjusting the settings on your machine, is to maybe use a little bit of a side-to-side motion. As you can see, that was kind of what I was doing all along, because with MIG welding, that's just something I generally do. Just a little side-to-side wiggle, you know, whichever way you're moving the puddle. And that just helps to flatten it out and put metal where there needs to be metal, as opposed to on top of other weld metal. So, that being said, I'll just take a wire brush and clean this off. Now, being a gas shielded process, there's obviously no slag to chip, just a little bit of smoke, and these little greenish brown blobs are just silicone. That's something in the wire for reasons I won't get into in this video. But yeah, there you go. Now if your welds are coming out too skinny, even with a side-to-side motion, then you know you're probably just going too fast. Likewise, if they're a gigantic blob, you're not going fast enough. But yeah, alright. Well, now that we have that taken care of, I guess it's time to talk about the pad of beads. Now, why are we going to run a pad of beads, and what does that have to do with anything, you ask? Well, quite honestly, much like the little exercise we just did, it's just something to help you breed familiarity with the MIG welding process and with, you know, getting some trigger time in. So once you're to the point where you can reliably start the arc and carry the puddle a little ways and then break the arc and terminate the weld, well then maybe you want to work on putting down some longer welds and maybe even throwing in a little bit of overlap. Alright, now to run a pad of beads, I'm just going to take my MIG gun and support myself just like I was during that last exercise. And the angles are going to be about the same. We want to be, well, for the first bead they're going to be about the same. And basically all we're going to do is run a bead, instead of an inch long, all the way across the plate that you got to work with. Alright, once we have our first bead in place, what we're going to do is take a look at our nozzle. As you can see, this one's starting to fill up with crap. And when that happens, you can take some side cutters or MIG pliers if you have them, that's even better. And just go around the inside and knock that ring of stuff out of there. Alternatively, if you don't, usually just a few taps on a table or the side of a table will knock that stuff out of there. Alright, so now the next thing we're going to do is to run a bead that partially overlaps the bead that we've already placed. What I'm going to do is actually run two beads now, three actually, let's make it. One with the proper amount of overlap to show you what that's like, one with too little, and one with too much. So, let's do it. Alright, now let's have a look at this, YouTube. As you can see, I'm using this soapstone as a pointer because this is obviously still really hot. This demonstrates proper overlap. You can see where each bead intersects the next one, but if you drag your finger or an extension thereof over top of this, it feels relatively smooth. There's not a huge gap like there is here. This is not nearly enough overlap, you know, as I mentioned, because there's sort of a big ridge here. We don't want that. And likewise, this is way too much overlap. This bead is pretty much just right on top of this one. What you're trying to do is to make the highest point of this bead basically intersect the highest point of this bead, and you can do that with about half to 2/3 overlap. This is obviously too much. There's a nice big ridge. If you drag your finger over here, it'll go down like such and over. You don't want this ridge, and you also don't want the beads stacked up right on top of each other. Now there is a lot more to MIG welding than just what I'm showing in this video. You're going to want to do little things like, you know, clipping your wire and staying at the leading edge of the puddle. But I'm not really going to go into those right now because it'd be total information overload for someone who's never done this before. So basically the goal of this video is to get you guys set up and to get you putting down metal and creating an arc and having some fun with it. And so basically, you know, I hope you guys have enjoyed it. In part 2 of this series, we're going to be welding some flat and horizontal position, lap joints, fillet welds, maybe a couple others. And, you know, from there we're going to do some vertical, then some overhead. And hopefully by the end of this series, even though it's not going to be quite as ideal as an actual, you know, welding education, it should be a lot better than nothing for you guys. At least that's what I'm hoping. So, I guess this about winds down the video. From this point on, I'm just gonna wrap up the old pad of beads here. And for you guys that are watching this, like I said, I hope you guys have enjoyed it. Now there's some homework involved. You know, it's not required. It's not like high school where if you don't do your homework, the teachers take it personally. I really don't care, but if you guys don't want to do this, then when you actually start welding out some fillet welds or you're doing other things and you're having issues, you're not going to know what's causing them or what to fix them, and that's, you know, on you. But basically, the quote-unquote homework is to watch another video I did that's on MIG weld troubleshooting. It goes over everything from incorrect gas flow to, you know, the angles you're going to want to use welding and a bunch of other stuff. And, you know, once you have a basic understanding of the process and how to do it and put down some metal like what we're doing in this video, I highly recommend watching that, because in the next video we're going to be actually welding out some joints, and that information is going to come in very, very handy. So I'll put a link to that in the description, or once all these videos are uploaded and it'll be in playlist form, it'll be, I think, over on that side or maybe over here, but that'll be the next video down. And now here in part 2, we're going to actually weld out some joints. So as you can see, I've got some corner joints set up as well as some fillet welds and lap joints. Now since you're learning MIG welding, you're actually kind of in luck, because in my opinion, when you MIG weld a fillet weld and you go to another joint configuration, it's not as big of a jump as it would be with some other processes. For example, stick welding a fillet weld versus stick welding a lap joint, to me feels a lot more different than MIG welding a fillet weld and MIG welding a lap joint. And so, well, that should hopefully make things easier on you. However, to make things harder on you, we're going to talk about a couple things that we didn't really worry about in part 1 of the series. Namely, wires stick out, that's a small one, and staying at the front of your weld puddle. That's a much larger deal. The first thing we're going to talk about is stick out. Stick out, as you probably know, is the distance which the wire extends from the tip, basically. And this is a lot of stick out. This is actually like way too much stick out, but if you bump the trigger or something, you end up with this, well, you kind of have something to work with. Now there's two things you can do about this. You can take the easy way out, which is what I usually do, and if I was going to be welding this corner joint, I'd position the MIG gun so that little piece of wire is actually in the joint. Thus, as soon as I started the arc here, the arc would break off the wire and the wire would just be in the joint, and I'd simply weld over it and it wouldn't cause any issues. But technically you're really supposed to clip this off about 1/4 inch long, they say, but if you have it shorter, in my experience, it doesn't really hurt anything. And another thing to keep in mind is when you first start a MIG weld, there's that sputtering sound before it goes to the bacon frying sound. Well, basically the sputtering is the arc breaking off little tips of the wire before an actual molten puddle, you know, forms. And what you're hearing is the wire hitting your piece of metal, kind of like that, before it has a nice, comparatively soft molten weld puddle to stab into, at which point you hear the bacon frying sound. So like I said, this is a much smaller deal than staying at the front of the puddle. Now this is important because if you're, well, you know, some people refer to the front of the puddle as the business end of the puddle, and I fully agree with that statement. You want to stay, if you picture a molten weld puddle, you really want to stay in the front third of it at most, maybe even a little bit less, maybe the front quarter of it, because that's where the welding's actually going on. If this tack here, let's say this tack is our weld puddle, back here this is already welded. Up here, it's not welded yet, thus if you keep the tip of the wire up here, you're putting metal where there needs to be metal, and it's going to burn in a lot better than if you keep it at the back of the puddle, where you're simply piling metal on top of other metal, and that's really not going to be strong at all, you know, comparatively, of course. And that's a really good way to get cold lap and to get welds, which are even worse than cold lap, because they look okay. They actually look good if you don't know exactly what you're looking for, but they're really weak because the metal went on top of other metal as opposed to fusing into the base metal. So that's something you're going to want to keep in mind and make an attempt to actively practice while you practice welding out some joints. So now let's talk about the material we're going to be using. This is only an 1/8 inch thick, and as you can see, it's ground clean. Now, as I briefly mentioned in part 1, MIG welding is not a process that deals well with contaminants on your base metal. On the left, on the thinner piece, you can see what ground clean metal looks like, and on the right, well, that dull gray stuff is called mill scale. That's alright with your MIG welding. you know, as long as you're MIG welding under normal circumstances. If it's something that's super critical, you probably want to remove it. But for general fabrication, you don't have to worry about mill scale. However, any form of rust, grease, paint, powder coating, that type of stuff is really bad. Now, you might be wondering why this is ground clean. Well, because these three little joint setups are left over from a TIG welding video I did, and TIG, well, you know that it has to be clean for TIG. So, that's that. And settings wise, well, I guess we're probably going to start out with the fillet welds first, and I'm actually kind of glad I have different thicknesses because maybe I'll have a chance to talk about welding different thicknesses in this video. But basically, I'm just going to come back over here to our handy dandy door chart, and let's see what we have. We're welding steel with ER70S6 wire and a C25 gas mixture. Thin wire 23 thousandths, 23 or 24, pretty much the same. So I'm just going to move this along. We got 18 gauge, 16, 11 gauge, or 1/8 inch. Alright, it wants me to set this for 5 and 80. So I'll come down here to our voltage, set that to 5, and well, this is already kind of at 80. Because I found with the 3/16 setting that it wanted a little bit more wire feed speed than I wanted to run, so I'll just turn this down a little bit, and we should be good. Now the last thing I'm going to cover before we actually start melting some metal is a couple of basic welding positions. Now, if you're looking at this joint here, it's laying flat on the table, and you might think to yourself, well, that's a flat position weld joint, when actually it's horizontal. A flat fillet weld or flat lap joint would be positioned such as this at a 45-degree angle, and that would be horizontal. That's a misconception many people, including myself, dealt with when they first started MIG welding. Now, what are the differences between actually welding a flat and a horizontal position weld? Well, in the flat position, because you're rotated to a 45-degree angle, like such, pretty much all you have to do is establish your puddle and guide it down the middle of the joint. And if you're going in perpendicular, then the puddle should spread equally between the two plates. However, in the horizontal position, you know, you can't really do that so much because gravity is going to have the effect of pulling your weld puddle down onto the bottom plate, so you have to kind of account for that, or else you end up with undercut and cold lap. What do I recommend starting off with, you ask? Well, I say go straight to the horizontal because honestly it's not that much harder and it is a lot more common. I mean, in all the stuff I build out here, I practically never weld anything in the flat position. 90% of the stuff's horizontal, the rest is vertical with maybe like a tiny little bit of overhead. But whatever the case, I think that horizontal fillet welds are going to be a lot more common in most projects than flat position ones. And for that reason, I think you're probably better off starting off with the horizontal. However, if you have issues with that, or maybe you don't feel confident enough just yet, there's nothing wrong with that. You know, then you can just start off with the flat position. And that's actually what I'm going to do here. Now, as you can see, the back side of this 3/16 plate is actually kind of rusty. So I'm just going to take my wire brush and knock this out of here. Alright, now it's good. Not just good, good enough. And I'll just use a couple of corner joints to hold this corner joint in the flat position, and I'll reference the settings on the inside of the machine just like we did for part 1 to get this set for 3/16. And then I'm going to be ready to weld. Now let's get set up for flat position inside corner joint, which is very, very similar to a fillet weld. It's just a little bit easier to rotate into the flat position. Basically, this ways I want to be directly in the center of the joint, so I'm going to be about straight up, and I'm going to use a slight push angle because, well, that's kind of my preference. But as I mentioned in part 1, I really think you should get good both pushing and pulling the puddle, because in some situations, because of the way the joints are set up or there's crap in the way, you won't be able to do one, you'll have to do the other. So, I'll put my helmet down and begin. Alright, now that's what happens occasionally, and when it does, I like to just give the nozzle a little tap. Right again. Nope, it's not feeding. Whatever you do, don't hold the trigger down, because if you do, the drive rollers are going to keep pushing the wire forward and it'll just bird's nest. It's probably just stuck somewhere. Nope, it bird nested. Well, crap. This is kind of a pain, and it really doesn't fit in with the plot of this video, what we're talking about. but I'm going to throw it in anyway because you guys will inevitably deal with this. A bird's nest is what happens when the drive rollers are pushing the wire forward, but the wire can't go forward, so it backs up and starts spewing out the side here. Pretty much all you can do is to turn your welder off, take the tension off of this, grab some side cutters, start cutting, and then feed unscrewed up wire through the liner and out the end of the gun. Yeah, this really isn't that big of a deal, YouTube. It's kind of a pain, but like I said, it's something it's going to happen to you sooner or later, unfortunately. It's a lot more prone to happen with thin wire like 23 thousandths than it is with 30 thousandths or 35. So maybe that's something else for you to keep in mind if you're still choosing which size wire you want to run. Alright, YouTube, take two. So that's about what we're looking for, YouTube. You know, I use the slight push angle. You can use the slight pull angle if you like to. Don't go too steep either way. But just a little side-to-side oscillation. Just a little being drunk at the wheel right there. and that's what we got. So, now that we've welded a joint in the flat position, let's weld one in the horizontal. Now here's our horizontal fillet weld, which, well, it's not technically an inside corner, but it is really friggin' like an inside corner, as you can see by the 90-degree resemblance here. And since this is only 1/8 of an inch thick, I've referenced the door chart and turned down the welder just a notch. And now we're gonna weld this thing out. So because it's a horizontal joint, I don't want to go into it at exactly a 45-degree angle. You know, with the flat, as I mentioned, I wanted to be in the middle of this plate and this plate, which would be like here. But if I do this, gravity is going to pull the puddle down onto the bottom plate. So I'm going to counteract that by going in at a little less of an angle. So, you know, the way I like to set myself up is to kind of get right in the middle of the joint, split the difference, so to speak, and go down just a tad. And then, here's another quick tip for you. You'll want to do a dry run down the joint without actually welding, because, well, okay, I guess there's more frustrating things, but it's still a bad time when you're just welding along, and then your lead gets caught on something and you're going like this and you got to break it loose, and your weld's going like this, or else you just got to stop welding and screw with whatever and come back. So, alright, quick tip of the day, always make a dry run before you weld something. Alright. So, pretty much the same thing, just I'll split the difference and go down just a tad, and let's do it. Alright, so here's the two joints I just welded out. The one you guys watched, and then there's the one I did for the arc shot. And we're going to have a look at these two welds, and we're going to talk a little bit about troubleshooting and all the things I fabricate and build and fix a lot of the time, well, I mean, this is probably the most common joint that I run in everything I do and have ever done, so just keep that in mind. Now, what you're looking for is consistency, primarily. I mean, if you're not consistent, you get little divots like that one right there. I don't know how well you guys can see that, but that is what's called a lack of fusion. This is caused by me just welding along and then quote-unquote missing that spot, and there's a little notch, as you can see, and if there was ever a lot of force placed upon this joint, that's probably where the weld would start to fail. So that's bad. You don't want to do that. But overall, you want your weld to be flat to slightly convex. Concave is a little bit weaker than flat, and anything that sticks out further than flat is it's really just wasted filler metal. So, yeah, behold, horizontal position filler weld. Now let's talk about lap joints. Well, this is obviously a lap joint. It's formed by one piece overlapping the other one, you know, hence the name. And these are actually really simple to run, especially with MIG. It's basically like a fillet weld, but instead of trying to tie into this plate, you just keep your puddle right about here, and what you're watching for is the edge of the puddle to envelop this top edge. And once it starts to envelop the edge, you know that you're as much on this plate as you need to be, and you just make your way down the joint. Now this is one joint where I actually prefer to pull the weld because it gives you a slightly more convex weld, which, well, for this, I think it helps. Did you guys hear how that was really sputtery? Well, I'm gonna throw this in the video just like I did that bird's nest, even though it's not totally relevant to what we're doing. Well, I guess it is. Whenever you're MIG welding and you notice an increase in sputteriness as you're welding, 9 times out of 10 that just means your tip's starting to get a little worn out and it's not feeding quite as well as it should be. And to fix it, well, all you need is another tip. It's really not a big deal. But, you know, I thought I'd throw that in. Alright, so here's our lap joints. And as you can see, I've got my pointer here. Basically, all you're looking for is for a weld that bridges the gap between one plate and the one that overlaps it. You want to look up along the top of the bead and make sure there's not a ridge that's kind of like undercut. Well, I guess it kind of is undercut. If you're getting that, what it means is you're not tying into the top plate as much as you really should be. And to fix it, all you do is move your weld over just a little bit more, you know, next time you run one. And you know, if you're tying into the top plate too much and you're adding too much metal to the puddle for the amount of heat that's going in, you'll get cold lap down here, which is shown as just a nice sharp ridge. Alright, now I'm going to turn our inside corner joints upside down. We're going to have an outside corner joint. This again is a lot like a fillet weld. This is obviously a flat one because it's kind of sitting at a 45-degree angle here. And so, because of that, pretty much all we're going to do is weld along here and try to tie into each side. And that, YouTube, is our outside corner joint. Now, a couple things of varying degrees of importance. First off, as mentioned, I pulled that because when you pull a weld, it has a slightly more convex profile than when you push a weld, which gives it a flatter and, in my humble opinion, a little bit superior profile. That was the first thing. Second thing, I'm kind of talking fast because my camera's about to run out of battery because I've been doing so much filmifying out here today. But, yeah, I guess that about wraps that up. And you know, I understand that watching a bunch of YouTube videos and trying to teach yourself in your garage or on your farm or whatever really isn't quite as ideal as being in an actual welding school, but you know, it's got to be better than nothing. I recommend getting an all-out welding education if that's an option for you, but I understand for a lot of people, for a lot of reasons, it's, you know, probably not that much of one. But anyway, yeah, here's some different horizontal and flat welding joints, and my honest advice for learning this is get good at fillet welds, and well, A, because from my experience, from what I do, they're generally the most common, and B, because once you can do a fillet weld pretty well, the other joints, you know, lap joints and corner joints, it's not that big of a jump. So now that we've gone through things like flat and horizontal welding, as well as the basic theory of MIG welding and machine setup in previous parts of the series, well, here in part 3, we're going to be doing some vertical welding. Now we're going to talk about welding both downhill and uphill, and what are the pros and cons of each, and so let's get started. First up, vertical down. Why? Because, well, in my opinion, it's a little bit easier to learn. Now, a vertical down weld would, of course, imply that you start at the top of the joint and work your way down, you know, vertical down until you reach the bottom of it. And vertical down MIG is a good skill to have, but it's a skill you kind of have to use responsibly, because even though it looks really good and it's pretty easy to do, short circuit MIG, like we talked about, is kind of a cold process. You know, it doesn't burn in and have the penetration that, say, you know, stick welding or dual shield flux core would have. So when you couple that with downhill travel, which in and of itself doesn't give very good penetration, you're left with a weld that you're best off using primarily on thinner material and for non-critical welds. But, like I said, it's still a really good skill to have, and here's how you do it. Basically, if you look at this poorly drawn diagram, you can see that vertical down MIG welding is, well, you know, I refer to it kind of like connecting the dots. If you just put a little weld dot at the on the inside of a corner here, then, you know, there's not a lot of metal there. It's probably not going to be very strong. But likewise, if you put a ginormous dot, kind of like that, it's going to be big and gloppy and ugly, and you know, it might just run out of your joint and fall on the floor or down your boot. But what you want to do is kind of put medium-sized dots and basically connect the dots. You know, you'd put one here, then go over here and let this solidify while you're welding this. Once this is welded, you put another one here and then another one here. And that's basically the Zweave. You know, it obviously looks kind of like a Z. And in my opinion, the two biggest things to keep in mind while you're doing this are that you want to be consistent and rhythmic so that your weld comes out looking uniform and not, you know, there's a lot of metal up here, nothing over here, and some undercut here. You know, this is something you're going to want to have a pretty steady motion as you do. And the other thing to keep in mind is you're really going to want to try to stay at the leading edge of the weld puddle. This will give your weld better penetration and superior mechanical properties to one, you know, where you stay at the back of the puddle. Not to mention, when you're welding vertically, you know, if you don't put the metal where there needs to be metal and you stack it on top of molten metal, because there's no, you know, flat weld joint holding it in place, it'll probably all just run out and be a big mess. Now let's talk about, well, I guess you call it torch angle or gun angle. Basically, I'm going to be going into this joint about like this, maybe with a slight uphill angle, but nothing major. You definitely don't want to go downhill, or else you're going to be pushing metal that way and it's just going to go like that. So basically, I would start up at the top of the joint like such, pull the trigger, make a dot, over here, another dot, over here, another dot, over there, another dot, and just back and forth all the way down this joint. Check out this awesome ground clamp holder, YouTube. Yeah, scrap metal. Someday when you're YouTube famous, you can have one this awesome. My ground kept falling off. There we go. All right, let's wire brush this and see how it turned out. There you go, YouTube. That's the finished product. And if you look closely and you follow those lines, you can see it's really nothing more than a few dots that have been connected. Now another thing I want to point out is that brownish stuff that's in the middle of our weld, that's just some residual silicone from in the wire. Doesn't really hurt anything, but it's probably not a bad idea to chip that off before you put on your next pass. Here's another one I ran earlier, and I'm showing this to y'all for two reasons. First off, so you can see what it looks like when that brown crap's been removed. I find the best way to remove that is either with a wire brush or you just drag something across like a pair of needle nose pliers. That's what I always did in school. But mainly I wanted to show y'all this so I could show y'all what not to do. And if you look closely at that toe line, you can see all those sharp little indentations. Well, that just means that I'm putting the dots a little bit further apart this ways, not so much this ways, but definitely this ways than I should be. And I'm leaving those little notches, and that's not a good thing because, well, if this weld was ever put under a lot of pressure, that would be a very likely place where the weld would start to fail. So you're going to want to keep that in mind too. And here's a couple other things to keep in mind before you go out and try this. First and foremost, if you've never done a vertical down MIG weave, I don't recommend starting off on the first pass. That's why I said earlier that it would be a good idea to save those flat and horizontal welds that you did in part 2 of the series, because that way you already have a first pass and you kind of have the convex, slightly convex face of the weld, or even if it's concave, there's still something there, and you just put a dot on one toe line, dot on the other toe line, and the toe lines kind of give you an outline to follow and where you're putting those dots, so you can focus on consistency and, well, proper dot placement. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is your crash course in vertical down MIG welding. Now, you know, as mentioned, it probably isn't a weld that's going to get the greatest penetration, so if it's something that I think is remotely critical, I don't like to do vertical down MIG on anything much thicker than 1/8 of an inch, maybe 3/16, but you know, if I've got thicker material or a more critical weld and I have to weld it vertically, I'm more likely to use 70-18 or maybe even TIG. But if that's not an option for me, well, I guess the next best thing would be vertical up MIG. It feels a lot different, it handles a lot different, and it does get quite a bit more penetration. It's still short circuit MIG, so it's not like a mind blowing amount, but it is going to penetrate a little bit better than vertical down. And, well, here's a couple common ways which you can do it. Now this is the first method which I'm going to talk about, and it's, surprise, surprise, the return of the Zweave. Even though vertical up MIG is considerably different than vertical down, the motion which I like to use really isn't all that much different. It's just a little bit inverted. Basically, if this is our weld puddle, I'd start here, go up, make a dot, up, make a dot, up, make a dot. I guess really it's up and over, but up and over, make a dot, and just all the way up the weld joint. Now one thing you want to keep in mind is that your molten metal's really going to need something to, you know, quote unquote stand on, and if you do the Zweave vertical up correctly, you'll kind of be making a shelf, so you're really stacking one dot partly on another dot. I mean, you don't want to literally stack the weld on top of the weld that's before it, because if you do, it'll just be horrendous cold lap. But the weld that you've done so far will kind of in a way support the weld that you're in the process of doing, if I worded that correctly. And another thing to point out is that when we did the Zweave vertical down, we kind of just did a straight across motion. When I do a vertical up, I like to throw in a little bit of an arching motion, partly because, you know, when you run MIG vertical up, the puddle has a strange tendency to almost want to sag, and this sort of counteracts the pull of gravity. Now we're about to see how he did, YouTube, but first there's just something that I kind of want to point out, and that's that when I film these things, you know, it's kind of hard to get MIG footage sometimes because the cone's a lot wider than, say, stick electrodes, so, you know, you can't really go in like this because you can't really see too well. So what I like to do is film from the top, which seems to work out, except, you know, watching the footage I've gotten so far on my camera's video playback, it looks like I'm shoving the MIG gun in there kind of like this, just because, you know, you're looking at it from the top here. But really, when you do vertical MIG, if this is flat, I'd like to be between here and about here. Definitely no more, definitely not like that, but probably a little bit more than flat, and certainly not pointed downwards. Alright, YouTube, here's our finished weld. Still got some of that silicone stuff on there. I popped some of it off, and that's what those scratch marks on the weld are from. And the rest of it's just starting to pop off as this weld cools. But that's what we're left with. Now, what do you want to look for in a weld like this? Well, first and foremost is the consistency. That's kind of something we talked about in the vertical down portion. And again, just like the vertical down portion, you're going to want to have a look along your till line. Make sure there's no notches and nothing looks like a lack of fusion or whatever. And pretty much that's all there is to it. Now, before we get going, I would like to say that overhead MIG welding, you know, if you can do everything we've done in the series so far, you shouldn't have any issues with this. I mean, you know, everybody struggles with some things more so than other people. I know I do. I guess everybody probably does. But overhead MIG is barely even deserving of its own video. I thought strongly about putting it at the end of the vertical video, but, you know, I figured two positions should get two videos. And that's why I'm making this. It's really not all that different, but basically the only thing different that you're going to need is something to attach a weld joint above your head with, or at least above eye level. Don't have it like up here or anything. You don't want to make it harder than you have to while you're still learning. But as you can see, all I'm using is a piece of scrap angle and a vise which is clamped to my table. Alright, so I now have a wood piece tacked up on my hillbilly, whatever the heck you're supposed to call this thing. It has a technical term, but basically the first thing I want to talk about that is relevant to what we're doing is that because we're welding overhead, you're going to want to protect yourself a little bit better from falling bits of wire and molten metal and whatnot. So I'm going to be donning the full welding leathers. If you have a set, well, you know, I have this set obviously, and pretty much the only time I use these is for overhead welding. Occasionally vertical, sometimes if I'm doing something really hot like dual shield flux core, but pretty much just overhead. Also, you'll want to button the collar so you can be like one of those cool kids with a pop collar, and mainly so that stuff isn't as likely to fall down your neck. Either that, or it'll funnel crap down your shirt. Could go either way, quite frankly, but I always like to button it. Alright, so that's the first thing I wanted to talk about, and next thing is that we're not welding vertical down. You know, with vertical down you have to worry about not getting enough penetration sometimes. It's a lot colder than regular MIG welding. Overhead welding, kind of like vertical up, it's basically the total opposite of that. It's going to be a lot hotter than welding in the flat position even, or vertical down. It's going to burn in a little bit better. You're going to get a little bit more penetration. And so you might want to set your machine accordingly. And now, one last thing before we get started. Let's just take a moment to talk about the way you're going to want to position your MIG gun and the angles you're going to want to use to weld an overhead fillet weld. So, basically, first off, if this was in the flat position and I was going to weld it, I'd want to position my MIG gun about 45 degrees from this plate, about like that, and about 45 degrees from this plate. So I'd be going down the middle of the joint like such. But the thing you gotta keep in mind is when you're welding in the flat position, gravity's not trying to pull your puddle from here down onto the floor, you know, like it is when you weld overhead. So pretty much all you need to do to counteract that, and this is the single most important thing you gotta keep in mind overhead welding, especially MIG, but, well, I guess it applies to about any process. Pretty much all you got to do is instead of going in at a 45-degree angle, you've got to come in at less than that, or more than that, depending on which plate you're measuring from. But basically what we're doing is we're trying to push the weld up so that it would favor the top plate, but gravity's in effect, I think, last I checked. Yep, alright. So basically, we have to account for that by favoring the top plate and having gravity more or less pull the weld puddle down onto the bottom plate. Now you don't want to exaggerate this and go in like that, because then you'll probably get some undercut and some cold lap. But what I like to do is sort of split the difference, come in at 45, and then take about half of what's left right here. So I'm going in about like such, plus, you know, figuring in whatever slight push or slight pull you like to use. Well, YouTube, that in a nutshell is overhead MIG welding. Much like with overhead stick welding, and well, I guess about like any other process, it's I'm just putting my gloves on because it's cold out here. But much like any other process overhead, it's not all that much different than flat or horizontal. Just a slightly different angle of attack, let's say. And it's not always, well, you can make really good looking overhead welds, but it's a little bit harder because, you know, you're working up here as opposed to being right down on a bench and gravity's pulling it down. I mean, you know, with the proper angle, you can counteract the force of gravity, but you can't turn gravity off. But I'm kind of rambling here, as you can tell. Kind of tired. But anyway, yeah, horizontal overhead MIG welding, not all that much different than flat or horizontal. Just a little bit of background knowledge you need to know, like the different rod angle. And another tip I'll share with y'all is you're going to want to brace yourself wherever possible. I mean, this is true for any position of welding, but especially overhead when you're working up here. And now it's like, if I'm here, probably about 7 feet down to my nearest brace. You know, if I can cut that in half by leaning on this table, I'm going to be a lot more stable. Hope you guys like it, overhead MIG welding. I hope it's everything that you hoped it would be. Hopefully you all can go out there and work in some projects, build some cool stuff, take it, practice, and make it your own. Now, I do have a couple other things I want to talk about. The first of which is that for anyone that watched my Teach Yourself Stick Welding series, I did a video just dedicated on thick and thin steel, you know, welding it with the shielded metal arc process, obviously. I didn't do that with MIG simply because it's not really any different. I mean, with an 1/8 inch 7018, I wouldn't want to weld anything thinner than like 3/16, and I wouldn't want to weld anything thicker than 1/4 inch in a single pass. You know, but with 30 thousandths MIG wire, you can weld auto body stuff to like, you know, 1/4 inch on up in a single pass, just depending on your machine. Pretty much, if you're welding thick stuff, do it multi-pass. I've done videos on stick welding multi-pass. It's the same thing, pretty much, just, you know, obviously with a MIG gun. You want to use those principles. If you're welding thin stuff, don't burn through. I know that sounds obvious. Not that I know, because I'm so awesome, I never burn through anything. But no, seriously, if you've got really thin stuff to MIG weld, what I advise is just practicing and intentionally burning through on some scrap metal, because it gets to the point where you can identify a burn through before it actually happens. You know, the metal gets kind of quote unquote soft, puddle handles a little bit differently, and then just like that. So if you learn to recognize before that happens, you got it made. Another thing to keep in mind is that everybody is going to tell you, I've even probably alluded to it a couple times, that, oh, MIG welding is so easy, it's the easiest process ever. And MIG welding is a very easy to run process. There are two catches. It is incredibly difficult to set up. Well, you know, it's harder to set up than most other processes, I'll put it that way. I've been MIG welding since like, I don't know, probably a good 4-ish years now. And I still find myself tweaking the dials on this thing between welds. You know, that's a little bit too much wire feed speed. Stick welding is a lot harder to actually do. However, you only have one dial to turn, you know, the amperage thing. And the mechanical aspect of a stick welder is a power source and 2 wires, and that's it. But with MIG, you know, you got the gas solenoid, you got a regulator, you got a cylinder, you got, you know, wire, really thin wire. Even if it's 45 thousandths, that's still pretty thin. It's 45 thousandths. And you're feeding that through a liner, which can get messed up, through rollers, which have to have a certain tension. There is so incredibly much to go wrong MIG welding. So, although it's easy to run, you've got those two things to deal with on the other hand, and it all balances out. I guess this about concludes the video, and until next time YouTube, thanks for watching. Don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe for more. Have a nice night, everybody. So I got some scrap metal, and you know what? If you want something messed up right, you're gonna have to roll down your sleeves and put on your helmet and screw it up yourself. So, alright, this is my awesome little to-do list here. Let's see, what are we gonna be talking about today? We're gonna be talking about traveling too fast. Pretty much everybody does that. Too slow. Pretty much everybody does that to counteract for too fast, too hot, too cold. Too much into a little wire, wrong polarity, oh that's a good one, no gas, and too much into a little stick out. Okay, well, let's begin. Alright, now let's get this welder set up. Now pretty much any, half decent welder you buy is going to have a chart like this on the inside, which is a welding guide for 230 volt wire welding package. Alright, so what you do is you just come down here to your material being used on this machine. I will say this is a very, very good chart. It's pretty much spot on, but you might have to tweak it a little bit, but this will get you going. 1/4 inch, voltage 6, wire feed 70. 6 and 70, and we're good. Now, you'd be amazed at how far you can get by just reading a chart like this. And like I said, a lot of welders are going to have something like this. Alright, now, let's move too fast. But first, I'm just going to talk for a minute about travel speed when you're MIG welding. Now, basically, you're going to want to stay towards the front edge of the puddle, that little molten blob that you're hopefully going to create. And the way it works is you're going to use a certain amount of heat to spread out a certain amount of metal that you're adding to your two pieces. And the problem is, if you go too fast, then you're spreading your metal too thin, and because you're going faster than you should be, you're not giving it adequate time to actually melt into the pieces of metal that you're welding, and you're gonna end up with a bead that looks like, well, let's find out. That was pretty dang fast, YouTube. Let's have a look. Alright, now as you can see, we have a nice narrow bead brought on by us not really giving that metal enough time to to pile up on itself and spread out the way it should. It's very high crown too, like I said, we're not really giving this enough time to melt into the base metal, and that's not good. That's going to be really weak. I could probably break that with the smallest of hammers. That's what happens when you go way too fast. Alright, next up we're going to be going way too slow. So, I like to tell people to think of a MIG weld, or really any weld for that matter, as a ratio of heat to metal. Basically, you're going to put down X amount of metal in your weld, right? And you have to put down a proper amount of heat. And what happens is, if you put down too much metal and not enough heat, then you don't have enough heat to melt the metal into, the base metal. And if you put in too much heat, that has its own problems that we'll talk about later. But, travel speed is one of those things. It's going to work hand in hand with that ratio of heat to metal. And when you go too fast, as you can see, we're not putting down enough metal, or enough heat for that matter, because we're going too fast, we're spreading it too thin. But what happens when you go too slow is the metal is just going to pile up, and so you're going to have a very large amount of metal, and because you're only putting in so much heat, because, that's how you have the welder set, you're not probably going to really do an adequate job of melting that in. It's just going to be a big blob, uncontrollable, nasty mess. And so yeah, let's go way too slow. Oh, look at that. That is just, doesn't look like a weld, it looks like some kind of metallic caterpillar, I guess. But basically, when you're going too slow like that, you're just going to have all that metal pile up on top of itself. As you can see, we have a lack of fusion along both toe lines. It's just a big out of control mess. The top of that weld should be fused nicely in, to the top of that plate, and same with the bottom, but it's not. It's just sitting there. All that metal just piled up on top of itself. And you'll know if you're going too fast by having that small, narrow, high crown bead. You got your The little ripples in the weld, notice how pointed they are? That's another thing you can look for. And if you have any of these things going on, then you're probably moving too fast. If it looks like your weld is just piled up on top of itself and a big and nasty mess like that, then you're probably going too slow. And you know, neither one's good. You want a nice balance of both. Like I said, it's a think of it as a ratio of metal to heat. And you know, if you're going too slow like that, that's a really nice way to overheat things and warp the crap out of them. Like I said, it's you're still putting in a lot of heat. It's not the proper ratio of heat to metal, but it's still a lot of heat because that's a big freaking puddle and it's going to hold a lot of heat in. It's a nice way to warp the crap out of stuff. In some cases, it's a great way to burn through, and it's just not good. So again, if you're going too fast, small, narrow, high crown bead with pointed ripples, and if you're going too slow, big, cold-looking blob. All right, let's move on. Now let's talk about wire feed speed, YouTube. All right, well, wire feed speed is what controls how much metal goes into your weld, because that's obviously how fast your welder is going to feed that wire out. And it's, of course, one of the main variables in that heat to metal equation I told you all about earlier. And how do you know if you're running way too much wire or not nearly enough wire? Well, here's how. Alright, now, while Chris starts welding away, basically I'm going to come over here and completely screw with the wire feed speed. So hopefully, this is going to start making some weird noises, hopefully making a big mess. And if your welder's doing the same thing, you'll know something's up with it. Alright, you ready? This is going to be too much wire feed speed. Now, as you can tell, there's this popping noise going on. Basically what's happening is there's too much wire and it's sort of almost poking the base metal. In extreme cases you'll feel this happening because the gun's going to be going like this. Alright, let's go the other extreme. That's sounding pretty good right in there. I will say this is an excellent door chart and the settings are almost spot on. Alright, this is not nearly enough wire feed. This is going to be some kind of disastrous attempt at globular transfer, and yeah, it's just not going to go well. And if this really doesn't go well, what will happen is the wire is going to burn back and completely destroy that tip. Alright, let's just come over here. That's about what you're gonna want it to sound like. That's pretty dang close. That's a scene from the other day. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Alright, now, you know, if you want your weld to go up a size or down a size, you're going to have to, obviously, add more metal. So if I wanted to put down a bigger weld than what this is set to right now, which I'd honestly probably need a bigger machine, but if I wanted to put down a bigger weld, what I'd do is I'd bump up the wire feed speed, and because we're now feeding more wire, we're going to have to turn up the voltage too. Because we're putting in more metal, we're going to need to use more heat to melt the metal. So if your weld is looking cold, there are two things you can do. You can, hang on, I'll set this back to the way it was. You can turn down your wire feed speed, thus reducing the amount of metal that goes into the weld, and so that same amount of heat can melt the smaller amount of metal properly. Or you can just give it another notch on your voltage, or turn it up a turn, or however your welder's set up. And what that's going to do is that's going to put more heat in to melt your amount of metal. So, again, wire feed speed is how much metal you're putting into your weld. Voltage is going to be how much heat you're using to melt that metal. I hope that makes sense. I don't really have a way with words, but I'm trying. And one other thing, YouTube, anytime you see me welding in this video, I'm going to be dragging the puddle along. You can push or pull with MIG because there's no slag to trap, of course. And my reason why I usually pull things when I'm making YouTube videos is because there's no nozzle in the way, hence it's a lot easier for me to get the camera looking down at the puddle. But like I said, it's really personal preference. If you want to push or pull your MIG welds, you know, it's I highly recommend if you're just learning to MIG weld for the first time, you try dragging the puddle along, pushing it along, and whichever one's easiest for you is the one that you stick with. And once you have that figured out to some extent, then you just figure out the other one, because once you have one down pretty well, the other one should come to you in no time. And then you can do what I do and just look at something before you weld and be like, yep, I think I'm going to pull the puddle there, I think I'm going to push it. And yeah, so, alright, now let's talk about stick out. The term stick out refers to how far it is from the end of that tip there, from behind the wire, that little circular thing that isn't the wire, it's not the nozzle. Yeah, and what it refers to is the distance from that to our workpiece. the stick out is going to refer to if we're going to be holding our gun out here or way in like that. And well, what happens if you run too much stick out? This is something that a lot of people do when they're first MIG welding. I know it's something I did when I first started, but basically it means that you're holding the nozzle too far back, and the wire isn't really doing so well, jumping the distance from the electrode all the way down to your workpiece. And basically, it's really thin wire, whatever you're MIG welding with. I mean, we're pushing probably 170, 160 amps or something right now through something that's 30 thousandths of an inch wide. It's going to get hot really fast, and if you're running way too much stick out, you're just going to be shooting little stubs of wire, the current's going to be melting them, and it's going to be a big mess. Or it's just, this is something you're going to get a feel for as you go along, and if you run way too much stick out, then it's just going to be, well, like this. Happy New Year! That sounded like somebody threw a box of those little Chinese snappy things into a fire. Not that I ever did that, I was a good kid. Alright, let's have a look at this. As you can see, there's a lot of spatter, something that vaguely looks like a weld, and it's that's what it's gonna be like if you're running way too much stick out. Now another thing, it looks like, especially down around here, we might be having some issues with gas coverage. Again, that's because we're holding the nozzle so far back that by the time the gas gets down to the weld, it's thinned out, it's dispersed a little bit, and it's not really doing its job. We got all those little broken off pieces of wire, and if you're running way too much stick out, well, now you know what that'll look like. Let's try a not so extreme case. Now at the very end, I tried to go ahead and shove it down in there so you guys can see the difference between way too much stick out and about the proper amount. But I guess I was a little bit slow, so that pretty much just affected the crater. But anyway, that's what it's going to be like if you're running too much stick out, you know, in more of a moderate sense. What I recommend for this is that you just experiment with it. You know, you'll know if you're not running enough stick out because you will have melted your nozzle or your tip directly to your workpiece. Again, been there, done that, happens to the best of us. And you'll know if you're running too much because it'll be all snappy and poppy, and again, like a 4th of July, I don't know, whatever those things are called. But anyway, here's the example with too much stick out. As you can see, it's a little bit cold. We still have a little bit of a lack of fusion along that bottom toe line. And I thought there'd be a little bit more spatter than there was, but running too much stick out can cause slightly more spatter. The main thing is, you know how when you're stick welding, if you have any stick welding background, you'll know that you can control how much heat to an extent goes into your puddle just by running a different arc length. You know, if you need a few more amps, you can pull back a little bit, and that longer arc is going to give you a little bit more heat, because you know an arc is a hot thing, and more of it you have, the more heat you're putting into your metal, and vice versa. Or if it's getting a little bit hot, you can push the tip of your electrode down in there and run a shorter arc. And to an extent, that's basically what stick out is with MIG, but it's flipped around. The further back you are, the colder your puddle's going to get, and the further in you are, the warmer it's going to get. So, you know, if you start welding something, you're like, it's a little bit cold, and but not cold enough where you really want to stop and adjust it, you can run a shorter stick out, and that'll heat up your puddle a little bit. Now, let's move on. Now let's talk about wrong polarity. As you can see, I've got my, what are these things called? Extreme Access Cobalts out here, and our polarity switch on this machine requires a 7/16 deep well. You pretty much just unscrew these nuts, switch the wires around, put them back on. This is on this particular machine. Now down on my HTP here, you have these DIN style plugs, and they pretty much just switch around. That's all there is to switch the polarity on this particular machine. I know some old millers are like this. I'm sure there's a lot of machines with this type of configuration. But back to the Hobart, and what we're talking about here, polarity is whether you're running electrode positive or electrode negative. Now with some stick electrodes, like, you know, 6013, you can run that electrode positive, electrode negative, AC, however you want. MIG solid wire, not so much. Generally, if you're running solid wire MIG, you're going to want to be using electrode positive. If you're running flux core wire, you're going to want to be using electrode negative. Now I know there's some dual shield wires, even some flux core wires that run on either polarity, but as a rule of thumb, as this nice little helpful chart will tell you, DC electrode negative for flux core wire, and electrode positive for solid wire. And how do you know if you're running the wrong polarity? Well, here's how. As you can see, YouTube, that was really loud. It sounded like a drive-by shooting. I noticed the end of the wire was kind of globbing up on itself before it hit the puddle. It was just not good. Here's what it looks like. As you can see, it's very tall, cold looking. Absolutely no fusion on that bottom tow line. It's that's just, you don't want anything to do with that. Now, this isn't something that's just going to creep up on you and out of nowhere unless you have a-hole friends who like to screw with your machine. But what I will tell you guys is when I first got this 187, I put some solid wire in it, and I was like, why is this just not going well? I could not for the life of me figure out why no matter what I welded, no matter what settings I used, it just welded like plain crap. And I was like, no, I got it on electrode positive, and I asked some people online about it, and like, switched to polarity. I'm like, no, I don't have to, I said it right. And then I finally broke down and switched it, and it just fixed everything, and then I felt like an idiot, and that was that. So, if you're having issues with your machine, and it just, no matter what you do, is not running right, just try switching the polarity. Alright, next up, let's see what happens when you weld without gas. Now I'm just going to turn this off, and you know, I'm aware that MIG stands for metal inert gas, but I'm pretty sure the inert gas, I don't think you actually need that. I think that's more of an option. Alright, as it turns out, I think you actually need the gas. Yeah, as you can see, we've got a lot of porosity in there, and you know, if you were to grind down this weld, it would literally look like Swiss cheese or some kind of honeycomb structure on the inside. And as it sits, that weld is going to have the tensile strength of, you know, Rice Krispies or something. And, you know, one surefire way to tell when you're not running gas is when you watch the puddle, or, you know, puddle, it's going to be all jittery, it's going to be shaking like that, as I'm sure you saw. And it's going to be really erratic, and honestly, I can even smell a difference. I don't know why it smells different, but it actually smells kind of bad. And it sounds different, it is different, and it's not right. There's nothing going on to shield our forming weld puddle from the outside atmosphere, so it's just, it's like I said, it's going to be like Swiss cheese, a honeycomb structure. Not good at all. Now, last but not least, let's talk about welding too hot and too cold. So, first off, how do you know if you're welding too hot? You'll probably burn through, and if you're not burning through or getting epic undercut, then you're not really welding too hot. You know, short circuit MIG, well, it's a nice process to run. It's great for a lot of things. I really like it. It's what's known as a quote-unquote cold process. Like, for instance, if you were going to stick weld some 1/4-inch plate in like a fillet weld configuration, about 125 amps should be plenty for that. But if you're going to MIG weld it, you're looking at 175, 200 plus, just depending on the wire you're running and a few other variables. And so, you know, unless you're running auto body sheet metal or really thin gauge material, you're probably not going to have issues with running too hot. And if you are, you're just going to burn through. If you're just welding along, and then all of a sudden everything just falls out, you're running way too hot. That's how you know. Or you'll have undercut, which is when you have your weld and then the plate, like the weld sinks into the plate and there's an unfilled groove there, which is bad because A, it looks really bad, and B, that can cause a stress riser and cause your weld to fail. Now, what a lot of people have issues with is what's known as cold lap or running too cold, and this is because MIG welding can be a little bit deceiving. Like, if you're going to be stick welding something, you put down a weld that's way too cold, you take one good look at it, you're like, that's way too cold of a weld. But when you're MIG welding, looks can be a little bit deceiving, and you know, MIG is a process that's notoriously famous for putting down a really good looking weld with very little penetration, very little fusion, very little tie-in, and because of that it's weak and it will fail and possibly have disastrous results. But there are a few surefire things you can look at to identify that while it's going on or after you've done it, and that's what I'm going to show y'all. Now, in order to not deeply penetrate into our base metal, we're going to be using this 3/8 plate. Well, basically, what's going to happen is this is not enough heat to melt the base metal. This is only enough heat to melt our filler metal, you know, our MIG wire. So what's going to happen is that's the only thing that's going to melt, and instead of going into the base metal, tying into it like it should, it's just going to pile up on top of itself because there's really nowhere for it to go, at least not running this low amperage. So let's see what that looks like. Wow, look at that cold lap. Alright, well, this is a joint that is not done too cold. And as you can see, we have our bottom plate, then we have our weld at about a 45-degree angle, and then it ties into our top plate. It's nice and flat. It's just kind of sitting in there. And for comparison, we have this, which is just a lump, as you can see. What's going on is, like I said, we're not tying into the base metal. That's a tack weld, by the way. We're not tying into our base metal, and the filler metal, the MIG wire, is just piling up on top of itself. As you can see, if you look along the bottom till line, where are we? Okay, there we are. If you look along the bottom till line, it's just a nice smooth transition from weld to base metal in our not too cold joint. And here, there is no transition whatsoever. Let me get this from an angle. Yeah, there is just no transition whatsoever. It's a ridge. It's a sharp ridge, and you do not want that at all. So if you're running too cold, well, that's what it's going to look like. So, you know what? This video has been fun to make. There's nothing like going out there and getting to screw stuff up for the cause in front of potentially thousands of people. And, you know, I hope this video has helped y'all out. And as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe for more.